Welcome, everyone. I'm Ellen Herman, co-director of the Wayne Morse Center for Law and Politics and professor of history at the University of Oregon. Welcome to our 2021 lecture for the Margaret Hallock Program for Women's Rights, which honors and carries forward the legacy of the center's founding director, Margaret Hallock. The mission of the Wayne Morse Center is to promote civic engagement, inclusive democracy, and justice by bringing together students, scholars, activists, policymakers, and members of communities, people just like you. We discuss a wide range of issues affecting Oregon, our nation, and the world. We work in the tradition of Oregon Senator Wayne Morse, who believed that political independence and education were building blocks of justice and democracy. If you aren't already on our mailing list and would like to hear about future events, please sign up on your website. We are hosting 2 public events during the next month that may be of interest. There will be a talk on April 29th by Alondra Nelson titled The Social Life of DNA, Race, Reparations, and Reconciliation After the Genome. Nelson is president of the Social Science Research Council and Harold Linder Chair and Professor at the Institute for Advanced Study. She is now also Deputy Director for Science and Society in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. There will also be a talk on May 4th by Evelyn Hammonds titled Historicizing COVID-19, Challenges and Questions. Professor Hammonds is chair of the Department of History of Science and professor of history and African American studies at Harvard University. She has written widely about epidemic disease, as well as race, gender, and sexuality in science and medicine. Today's event is funded by the Lorwin Lectureship on Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. Many thanks also to our co-sponsors, the University of Oregon Department of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, the Labor Education and Research Center, and the Center for the Study of Women and Society. Thanks are always owed to the members of the amazing Wayne Morse Center team, Thea Croman, Rebecca Dinwoody Flynn, Abby Stilley, Dan Titchener, and Christine Waite. We are especially and always grateful to members of the Wayne Morse Circle. Circle members provide critical support for our programs through annual donations, small, medium, and large. Please consider becoming a Wayne Morse Circle member with a donation of any amount. Before I introduce our speakers, let me just clue you in about today's format. We will begin with some comments from Erica Smiley and then have a conversation between Erica Smiley, Margaret Hallock, and Lisa Hubbard. Beginning somewhere around 1 o'clock, there will be an opportunity for questions and answers from you, the members of our audience. Please submit your questions by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Although you will not be able to see them, trust me, I will be collecting them and will get to as many of them as I possibly can. Now, I'm delighted to briefly introduce today's speakers. Erica Smiley is the Executive Director of Jobs with Justice, where she has been spearheading strategic organizing and policy interventions for nearly 15 years. Smiley has served in numerous leadership capacities at Jobs with Justice, including Senior Field Organizer for the Southern Region and Organizing Director. Prior to joining Jobs with Justice, Smiley organized with community groups and unions such as the Tenants and Workers Support Committee, now called Tenants and Workers United in Virginia, and SEIU Local 500 in Baltimore. Her career in social and economic justice began in the reproductive justice field, serving as National Field Director for Choice USA, which is now United for Reproductive and Gender Equity. Smiley is a Will Empower Fellow, that's a joint project of Rutgers University and Georgetown University, and is currently co-authoring a book on bargaining and working people democracy with Sarita Gupta. As one of the few queer Black women leaders in the labor movement, Smiley has helped to seed numerous initiatives that prioritize the demands and voices of vulnerable working people in socioeconomic and political decisions that directly and indirectly impact their individual lives, families, and communities. Margaret Hallock is the founding director of the Wayne Moore Center for Law and Politics. Margaret is an economist who taught at U of O, served as Oregon's senior economist, and worked as director of research for the Oregon Public Employee Union before returning to the University of Oregon to direct the Labor Education and Research Center between 1988 and 2001. She also worked for Service Employees International Union 503, where she led the struggle for pay equity for women workers. She served as a policy advisor to Governor Ted Kulongoski for labor, revenue, and workforce development. Since her retirement in 2015, Margaret Hallock has served on the boards of Sponsors, which is a local and wonderful reentry organization, and Planned Parenthood Advocates of Oregon. She still devotes a great deal of time and energy to the Wayne Moore Center, for which we are enormously grateful. And finally, Lisa Hubbard is the interim executive director of Portland Jobs with Justice. They learned the value of solidarity growing up in a union family and spent more than 30 years as a strategic campaigner, organizer, and movement builder with low-wage workers and communities of color across the United States. They have led a combination of union and community organizing, politics, policy, and communications at the National AFL-CIO, UFCW, SEIU, a state labor federation, local unions, and with the building trades. They find their greatest joy in imagining and helping to create powerful communities of labor and community-based leaders working together for racial, economic justice, and gender justice. We at the Moore Center are delighted and honored to have these three important leaders share their ideas with us today at such a critical moment in this country about the kind of democracy that is worth fighting for. Smiley.
Thanks for that fantastic introduction. It's been such a privilege and an honor to have been asked to participate in this this afternoon. I guess this afternoon here. My name is Erica Smiley, and everyone calls me Smiley. Good afternoon, friends. Really excited to be able to share some words at this critical moment in time. And I used to laugh. I even, like now, I think about saying that, this critical moment in time. I used to laugh when people open their remarks with this. If I could look back even on the presentations that I've given over the last several years, I'm sure I've overused this phrase, but I think we can all agree that this is a pivotal moment for our country. We are still grappling with the vicious murders of so many people, unusually high, even in a US context. You know, here we are attempting to slowly resurface as a society post a 100-year pandemic, entering a society somewhat unhinged. There was this awkwardly funny meme going around on social media earlier last week, actually, with the author stating that someone hit on his 70-year-old mother while she waited in line for the COVID-19 vaccine, and that if this is what we have to look forward to this summer, we're in a lot of trouble. And perhaps far less funny is what many of us experienced last summer after the murders of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and now kicking off the spring with Daunte Wright and many others. All of this makes this particular moment both a major political inflection point, as well as a source of great personal anxiety for many working people, particularly those of us who are not white. You know, I want to tell a story. I'm an expat Southerner, originally from North Carolina. I live in New Jersey now, but my North Carolina heritage is alive and well when my accent slips. And you know, we tend to communicate in stories. So this probably won't actually be the only one I share even. When I was a young person, I wasn't always the most strategic decision maker. Despite being a math and science nerd, getting into college, having a world of opportunities before me, I was still a kid. And kids can act stupid sometimes. And one night, I happily found myself out drinking cheap liquor in a vacant lot near the school, just hanging out, loitering, underage drinking. Don't judge me. Some of y'all have done much worse. I was the youngest kid hanging out, the smallest, the only girl, and one of two Black people in the whole group. And I remember thinking how cool I was to be hanging out with these knuckleheads. When the police arrived, we all scattered. Well, I should say that we tried to scatter. We were too drunk to walk, let alone run. And as my underdeveloped brain contemplated what to do, I turned to face the officer and realized he had his gun pulled on me. Only me. All my friends were looking at me and putting their hands up, so I did the same thing. If I'd run, maybe he would have pulled the trigger. I'll never know. And frankly, I don't like thinking about it. But in that moment, beyond being scared to death, I thought about how disappointed my family was going to be given everything they had done to help me get out and be successful. And I kept wondering why the gun was only pointed at me. I still wonder about it. But he didn't shoot. And I went back to school, graduated, went on to organize, contributing to a democratic society alive. Many of the people you work with have similar stories, and many of them carry the same anxiety as more and more states open up and go back to normal. We can never go back. And until the leaders of our movement speak to the needs and anxieties of our true base, our full base, our shared future remains precarious. Despite defeating Donald Trump in the 2020 elections, the political situation is still characterized by right-wing populism and how motivated or disgusted you are by it. A resurgence in right-wing populism has grown in numbers and boldness, both in the United States and globally throughout the last decade, emboldened by authoritarian leaders like former US President Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin of Russia, Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro, and Boris Johnson of Great Britain. You know, the reckless rhetoric of these administrations and their antagonistic relationship with facts has emboldened the most racist, xenophobic, sexist, and homophobic elements of our society. And perhaps nowhere was this more apparent in the United States, at least, than during the insurrection of January 6th, when the Confederate flag made its first public appearance in the US Capitol since the Civil War. The act was a reminder of what we're up against, and not just a symbolic reminder. Historian Eric Foner elaborates on how Reconstruction-related policies sit at the root of modern-day conflicts in his most recent book, The Second Founding, How the Civil War and Reconstruction Remade the Constitution. You know, the early Reconstruction periods were, by many accounts, marked by attempts to build a multiracial American democracy in all aspects of society. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which abolished slavery and all forms of forced labor. The 14th Amendment, which started to define citizenship. The 15th Amendment, which started to define who could vote, all represented efforts to actualize democracy. And many of the gains made by progressive social movements since then were anchored in the promises of these constitutional amendments: women's suffrage, the New Deal, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. It's important to see that the work before us today is 150 years in the making to complete the grand project of building a multiracial democracy in the United States, perhaps for the first time. During the Obama administration, we attempted and failed to pass the Employee Free Choice Act to expand on the 13th Amendment. Shortly after, we tried, also less than successfully, to pass comprehensive immigration reform to build on the promise of the 14th Amendment. And we are in a live fight to renew the promise of the 15th Amendment by advancing the Voting Rights Act. These are all small d democratic fights, you see. Because democracy is more than elections. While passing legislation is an important aspect of democracy, policy is also made at our work sites, our apartment buildings, our community centers, and various other programs and agencies that impact us economically. Working people must have enforceable, not just advisory roles in governing everywhere in order to have a healthy democracy. Our opposition could not be clearer about what democracy means for them. They have spent the last 150 years trying to eliminate it. These same gains have been targeted by conservative judges and elected officials who have intentionally, systemically rolled them back, many to pre-Civil War interpretations of the Constitution. The Reconstruction project was incomplete, stopped in its tracks by those who wanted to reclaim control of wealth for a select few and put Black and immigrant communities back in our place. If not on a plantation, then as precarious wage laborers. Even the protections we managed to put in place for wage laborers included exemptions for work done by women and people of color, such as farm workers, domestic workers, immigrants, and currently and formerly incarcerated people. And corporate CEOs have built on the practice of establishing subcategories of workers with limited rights, such as the modern day gig worker or misclassified independent contractor, all direct descendants of laws preventing Black workers from earning wages through exploitative employment relationships like sharecropping or receiving tips based on a subjective experience of their service as opposed to receiving a fair wage. You know, best put by Barbara Fields, who appeared in Ken Burns' documentary series, The Civil War. The Civil War is still going on. It's still to be fought, and regrettably, it can still be lost. Until we recognize this fundamental tension, our opposition will continue to exploit these dynamics to erode our base, people who should be aligned with us against common enemies. Instead of identifying their actual exploiters and joining with immigrant communities, Muslims, communities of color, to make progressive change around our shared self-interest, working class white communities can often fall prey to the reactionary solutions touted by the extreme right that speak to their narrow, fear-based self-interest. This is not just a matter of doing what is morally right. It is a strategic imperative for our movement's survival. I want to talk a little bit about collective bargaining. You may ask, like, how is this labor, jobs with justice? You keep talking about democracy. We thought you were going to talk about collective bargaining. Let me talk about collective bargaining. Again, democracy is not just a system of political practices. It must be applied to participation and decision-making in all aspects of our economic lives as well. Without one, the whole system of democracy is compromised. Collective bargaining is fundamental to democracy, particularly when we think about economic democracy. Collective bargaining at its best is a system by which working people can exercise collective power in a way that directly confronts the owners of capital and in ways that reclaim portions of that capital back to working people and our communities. It has served as a direct mechanism to fight for a fair return on the labor we put into building, operating, servicing, or moving something. Collective bargaining allows everyday people to practice democracy, directly engaging in the decisions and choices that impact their lives. And as a result, collective bargaining has provided a pathway to economic sustainability for millions of workers, ensuring they can support themselves and their families. For most of the past century, a union contract has been our best weapon to ensure access to staples of a social safety net, such as healthcare, retirement income, and other benefits often provided in other democracies directly by the government. But collective bargaining is a means to an end. It's not the end itself. You don't tell people they have the right to elect a senator. You say they have the right to vote. Likewise, only telling people they have the right to form and join unions misses the point. They have the right to organize and collectively bargain, whatever that needs to look like based on their economic relationships and the economic relationship they have to those currently exploiting them. We need not always limit it to how it is currently practiced by most unions. And in fact, many 20th century protections have been eroded and even perverted to limit the democratic activities of the working majority. Even what we were able to codify through the New Deal only came after hundreds of thousands of workers were in motion demanding an equal seat at the table. So it's important for us to imagine what a 21st century framework for collective bargaining might look like, a framework that allows the majority of workers in this country to organize and collectively bargain. Together, we must draw new pictures of the 21st century union, either adapting into them or putting energy into building with new groupings coming online each day. Because of shifts in capital, economic democracy in the 21st century cannot be achieved solely on a framework focused exclusively on work sites supported by the legal framework of the National Labor Relations Act. Rather, organizers must explore a more expansive definition of collective bargaining that adapts to the context of global capitalism and all its features, including addressing the material and cultural needs of the modern worker, who shockingly doesn't solely identify as a worker, but instead sees herself as having a diverse array of identities. This means ultimately changing the very nature of what a union contract covers, broadening what individuals can negotiate over and who they can negotiate with, from their direct boss to the individuals with concentrated power in their sector or community. And of course, confronting the system of white supremacy and movements for white nationalism must remain a central element of this overall strategy to prevent the opposition from dividing workers and weakening our collective power. When we do this, we win. It's that simple. Like I said, this is not about what is just morally right, but actually is a strategy for success. Not doing this is a guarantee of our defeat. Working people have altered the relations of power and reshaped the frameworks of collective bargaining by building out explicitly multiracial strategies against common enemies. This is not something that is new. This is something that we have a history that we've done before. In their long struggle to unionize workers at Ford Motor Company in the late 1930s and early 1940s, the United Auto Workers had been excluding Black workers from their organizing efforts. And many white workers didn't believe Black workers should get equal pay for equal work. The company had successfully thwarted unionization efforts playing into these divisions, not only offering jobs to Black workers, but also promoting them into higher level positions, including within their own security forces. In doing so, Henry Ford clouded his own racist, anti-Semitic viewpoints with a new reputation that saw the company as a pathway, albeit a paternalistic pathway, out of poverty for Black workers, pitting them against the mostly white union. Black workers who were supportive of unionization efforts pushed the UAW to realize that in order to expand their union's density in the industry, they would have to confront white supremacy. Thus, the United Auto Workers began exposing the discrimination Black workers still faced in Ford plants, including the overwhelming majority of Black workers in low-paying jobs. Pushed by the demands of Black workers, the union started to hire Black organizers and began engaging Black communities. And they were pushed to look at and renegotiate some of their existing collective bargaining agreements that had consistently disadvantaged Black workers in promotions, seniority, and higher paying conditions. The comprehensive effort united the interests of Black and white workers in the auto industry, leading to increased bargaining power at Ford and throughout the sector for all workers. The efforts gave birth to a new Detroit local, UAW Local 600, which included Black workers and still exists today as one of the union's most powerful locals. These workers' relationship to the union and to bargaining rights was based in campaigns that confronted discrimination. And leaders coming out of the local, having demonstrated their ability to win significant gains for workers and their families, established channels that would develop new and inspiring leaders for future struggles, training other organizers and agitators in the Black community, who then went on to lead campaigns around housing, public education, and voting rights. Our generation is just as creative. In a historic action, incarcerated workers throughout the country went on strike, starting with an initial call from workers in 3 prisons in Alabama on May 1st in 2016, led by the Free Alabama movement, and then spreading to workers in prisons across 11 states. When predominantly Black inmates in Alabama took action against inhumane conditions at W.C. Holman Correctional Facility, including forced labor and violence, the prison guards, many who were white, also went on strike in September 2016 over safety concerns and overcrowding. Prisoners called the facility a slaughterhouse, given the number of stabbings that occurred, and yet inmates still supported the situation of the predominantly white guards as well. Several 21st century movements have integrated the struggle against white supremacy with campaigns for workplace power and profound scalability. In November of 2014, protests in Washington, D.C. that mobilized in response to the acquittal of Missouri-based Mike Brown's police murderer managed to shut down a local Walmart store, prompting several retail workers to join in the chants. Later, the courageous commitment to address anti-Black racism from SEIU's Fight for 15 effort in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement demonstrated another example. The July 2016 National Convention of the Fight for 15 workers took place in Richmond, Virginia, to highlight the need for racial justice with the backdrop of the former capital of the Confederacy. I realized talking to folks on the West Coast, we have to really distinguish Richmond, Virginia versus Richmond, California. One is the the seat of the original Confederacy. The other is not, obviously. But Fight for 15 workers who went on strike in Charlotte, North Carolina also protested the murder of Keith Lamont Scott, a Black father of 7 murdered by police near his home in September 2016. And both movements quickly realized that they could not win one without the other. The victories won by these collaborative movements go far beyond the fast food industry, in large part because SEIU decided to focus on a bold demand for its predominantly Black worker base, knowing that white workers and other workers of color were equally impacted by such poor standards. The fight for $15 an hour minimum wages flooded cities and states nationwide. It's become a framework for workers in low-wage sectors, the public sector, and even in manufacturing, where what used to be good jobs are now low-wage, benefiting white workers and workers of color alike. Making race central to an organizing and collective bargaining strategy generated momentum and success far beyond their immediate base. In this case, establishing a new floor for what was an acceptable minimum livable wage in the United States. And the same is true when considering the necessity of combating patriarchy and gender discrimination in our efforts to democratize the economy, and when thinking about collective bargaining specifically. Working with a new trade union initiative in India, Jobs with Justice helped to build the Asia Floor Wage Alliance back in 2005. It's a collaboration of trade unions and organizations based in the garment sector within South Asian countries, with the goal of establishing a cross-border minimum livable wage, or a floor wage, based on globally defined standards for caloric intake. To anchor this work in the United States, Jobs with Justice houses Global Labor Justice, a campaign organization that organizes on this side of the ocean to target multinational brands based here. Now, together, these organizations have supported a campaign to stop gender-based violence in the garment supply chain. And despite the fact that most garment workers are women, many of the union leadership in several countries are men. To project the direct voice of women workers, both in their unions and within the industry, the Asia Floor Wage Alliance and Global Labor Justice created a committee on gender-based violence, run and led by women workers of these garment unions. And this committee presented a set of standards and demands at the International Labor Organization Conference on Supply Chain. And in targeting some of the multinational brands, they were able to join the Me Too movement in getting a set of companies to the table to negotiate better standards. Companies who the male union leadership had so far failed to fully engage solely on shop floor issues. You see, these efforts prove that centering the fight to destroy white supremacy and centering the fight to combat patriarchy once and for all is not only about a morally just thing to do, but is actually critical to winning democracy for everyone. They represent real steps towards lasting attempts to deeply align and integrate these struggles with the goal of expanding bargaining rights for all of us, including reimagining who is in a position to negotiate and what we can negotiate over, all as a part of a larger shared struggle to confront corporate power and expand democracy. Through intensive community and/or workplace organizing campaigns that clarify the real beneficiaries of their conditions, white workers understand that the short-term benefit of discrimination against Black workers, immigrants, refugees, Muslims is merely a facade to keep wages low for everyone, including them. Without white supremacy normalizing the practice that Black and brown workers should be paid less than white workers, companies would have less incentive to hire workers of color at lower wages. Instead, both white workers and workers of color would be in a position to fight together against employers looking to cut corners. And they could collectively fight for better wages and improve conditions at the worksite and in their communities. Like I mentioned, I grew up in North Carolina. Kids like me didn't know what a union was, and there were precious few people around who would take the time to explain it to us. Unlike Lisa, I didn't come from a union family. My first direct action was with my church, St. James Presbyterian in Greensboro, North Carolina, a boycott of Kmart. I was 16 years old. I didn't know what a union was, but I knew that the discrimination workers were experiencing in that store, people who went to our church, was not fair. And I watched power and collective action change their situation for the better. Our institutions are made up of people who are union members, or at least members of organizations that are able to support and develop them in making this case. But we will not win unless we support a movement of people who do not have access to our democracy practicing institutions, but want it, a group which represents the majority of workers in this country. And frankly, whether we're ready or not, many workers, particularly Southern Black workers, have long been ready. Whether we're talking about sanitation workers in Memphis, auto workers in Mississippi and Tennessee, shipyard workers in Norfolk, or today's Amazon workers in Bessemer, Alabama, Southern Black workers, and many white workers too, have been ready to fight for 21st century frameworks for economic democracy. And frankly, are tired of dragging union leaders kicking and screaming to the Southern region to help. Why do we think the laws are so skewed against unions in the South? It's because that's our most potentially militant base of working people. Why on earth would we as a labor movement keep leaving all that power on the table? Today, our job is to infuse the energy of workers who are already in motion, whether our institutions are involved or not, into structural changes that will lead to increased participation of those directly impacted in governing the standards and conditions of their workplaces, industry, and economic lives. Nationally, this entails an agenda to expand voting rights at work, framing the PRO Act and other labor law reforms like the Power Act or the Essential Workers Bill of Rights, or Public Sector Freedom of Association Act, in the same context as the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, and the thus far failed Equal Rights Amendment, all of which were designed to make the democracy-oriented amendments to the US Constitution work better in practice. And it requires us to see infrastructure, not just in terms of roads and highways, but the infrastructure that sustains the abilities of women to work, such as building up the care economy. We have an opportunity to fulfill the promises of Reconstruction and carry through our push to expand democracy to all forms of public life, intentionally choosing campaigns that align the shared self-interest of white workers, Black workers, and all workers of color against systems of white supremacy and corporate control. It is time to reclaim our country and the vision so many of our ancestors intended for our future. It's time for us to really imagine a democracy worth fighting for. Thanks for having me.
Smiley, it's Margaret. Thank you. What an honor it is to have you present such a tremendous and optimistic even talk on this program. I am just so grateful to you. I'm a big fan of Jobs with Justice and have been an activist. The name says it all, Jobs with Justice. And I think that now the time has really come for the Jobs with Justice approach to blossom and to bring together the community and worker campaigns that we need to reestablish economic democracy and to build on equality and especially more racial justice. Thank you for lifting up the notion of an economic democracy. I don't think a lot of people think of our democracy as counting in the workplace, but the workplace is the least democratic place in our society. You check your right to free speech at the door. You have many times no rights of representation or assembly, and you can be fired at will for many things. But as you note, our political democracy is also extremely weak. We're still fighting the 150 years of white supremacy. And now there's over 300 legislative bills in the state houses around the country to further suppress the vote and to limit the rights of people to vote. But fortunately, union and community organizing has a role in both of these. Unions is clearly, I think, has been shown to be the most effective way to bring racial understanding at the workplace and to reduce the wage and gender wage gap and to fight discrimination and white supremacy. But we also need real changes in the political national democracy and the policies that frame the workplace democracy to really succeed. Many people call for a new deal, and that would be a good start, but it's not nearly enough. I mean, the New Deal did three things that were really important. It gave a tremendous boost to organized labor. It constrained capital and their sort of ability to suppress workers. And it helped concretely working people with new programs like Social Security and the GI Bill and jobs. But it was also based on a racial framework because it excluded jobs where people of color work in the domestic sphere and in agriculture. And also the GI and the New Deal deliberately enhanced segregation and discrimination by its housing policies and excluding certain people from its benefits. So we have to go way beyond the New Deal, but the framework should be the same: give a boost to organized labor, constrain capital, and provide policies for working people. So the PRO Act, as you mentioned, can really help with this. For those of you that don't know about it, it's called the Protect the Right to Organize, and it would outlaw, or it would refrain companies from using some of their most reliable ways to defeat union organizing, such as firing workers who affiliate with the union, retaliations, captive audience meetings. It would overturn the so-called right to work laws that inhibit unionization, and it would speed collective bargaining and protect striking people from permanent replacement. So we are seeing, fortunately, an uptick in public acceptance of unions, and these and a really exciting array of multiracial community worker organizing campaigns. I also wanted to lift up the Fight for 15 that you spoke about, headed up by SEIU. It's a multiracial campaign that's concretely winning higher wages for workers in many parts of the country. Still have to get the federal minimum wage to be higher, but that's a really good step. But another exciting area is the healthcare organizing, where workers are going beyond the traditional wages that for collective bargaining and moving into new areas that as you correctly point out, in the 21st century, you have to be concerned with the whole person organizing. So nurses striking for better staffing and for quality care, teachers the same, for the nature of the classroom. Oregon was among the first states to organize home health care workers, which gives a representation and benefits and a wage structure to people that take care of others in their home. And I'm really excited about the care economy infrastructure that you also mentioned. I attribute it in large part to the new slate of feminist economists that are advising President Biden. They've been working on this for a long time, and the goal is a universal, unified infrastructure that would allow people to actually work. So it would involve pre-K education, childcare, long-term care, and paid family and medical leave. We are discussing how to pay for that. Myself, I like the social insurance approach based on ability to pay with subsidies. But whatever, to move this forward as a part of a public good is a real step forward. All of the campaigns that you mentioned share two features. They're led by people of color, mostly women, because they are the most affected, and they go beyond wages to these broader issues that face workers, including housing, healthcare, and environmental justice. I just finished reading Heather McGhee's book called The Sum of Us, which is SUM, Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone. And she shows that when you explicitly center race in campaigns, you win, just as you were talking about, Smiley. And then when you do that, there's what she calls a solidarity dividend, that we gain so much by centering race and bringing white people and Black people together to confront white supremacy and win for everyone. The metaphor that she uses in her book is the public swimming pool. And she points out that in the 50s and the 60s, white communities decided to fill in their public swimming pools with dirt and concrete rather than integrate them. And as a result of zero-sum thinking that whatever would benefit Black people would harm or take away from white people. And instead, she points us to this solidarity dividend that is possible when you organize in multiracial campaigns. And she says it's time to refill the pool. Well, that's exactly right. It's time to point our targets at public goods. So I'm an economist. A public good is a good that the market cannot or will not produce. Things like public schools, infrastructure like highways and bridges, but also a care infrastructure. We as a society are so far behind. We rely on ridiculously low wages that subsidize the very inadequate care infrastructure that we now have. And those are mostly women of color and immigrants. And I think that that's one of the things that we all need to join in and help make that happen. So thank you for your work on these community campaigns and your tremendous vision for us. And I know Lisa also does the same kind of work, so I'm happy to pass to her. Lisa.
Thanks, Margaret and Smiley, for such a sweeping and incisive, covering the wide place where our movements are. And I wanted to lift up the fact, Smiley, you described yourself as a Southern expatriate. Appreciate that I lived in Greensboro and worked in the U.S. South for several years, and that we met in Greensboro, home of the seminal Woolworth sit-in and the kickoff that those Black NCA&T students led so long ago.
That's right. That's right.
And thinking about the South, I love that you said that we're leaving power on the table when we ignore the the rights and the movement infrastructure that we still need to build in the South. Examples of both big D Democratic fights, as there was in Georgia recently, and certainly as we continue to see the multi-phase fight that Bessemer, Alabama workers at Amazon will continue to lead to fight for, little d democracy in their workplace. What is some of the additional attention or lessons that you would draw from Southern movements and Southern Black leadership that we could draw from in strengthening community and labor connections?
Yeah, I love that question, Lisa. And you gotta, folks don't maybe not know, but like Lisa, you're like one of my own superstars. You're like a total catch in terms of this movement work, and I'm so glad to get to work with you at Jobs for Justice. And Margaret, holy cow, to get to be able to kind of be in conversation with you on some of these big questions is just unbelievable and necessary. And it is not a surprise that it is, you're right, it is women who tend to be leading this, and that's always been the case, including in the South. There was like I think it was probably in Hammer and Hoe. I think there was a great story about how the women used to be the ones that would go and negotiate the rates with the landlord around sharecropping, because they would be perceived as less of a threat and less likely to be, persecuted for asking for the appropriate rates. And so like there's this whole sub economy that came through that, and how they would have these sewing clubs in the fields to make it look like they were just kind of, doing sewing and hanging out, but we're actually organizing, and kind of the pretext around this. Anyway, I digress. So anyway, all that is to say, I really appreciate this kind of encuentro we have here. There's so many lessons to draw. One of the things that I said at the end of my remarks that I feel like is exceptionally potent given the defeat in Bessemer is, we've seen this so many times. Bessemer is the most recent. We saw the machinists lose over and over again in South Carolina. The auto workers lost in Volkswagen in Tennessee and Nissan in Mississippi. There's a real sense that like Southern workers, particularly Black workers, have been trying to organize. These are people who have long lost, if they ever really had any of the protections granted by the New Deal. And I really appreciate your kind of articulation of that, Margaret, because it's like the New Deal would be great, but we can't make that fundamental compromise that the New Deal made, which was to cut out huge sections of the working class who had been in motion in the lead up to the New Deal. And so that's like one thing. And we've got a situation where we have these, in some ways, perhaps our most militant base of the labor movement being in this region that is, you know, the most repressive against their ability to organize and collectively bargain or have any form of democratic rights, as we already noted in the regressive policies just passed in Georgia and now being copycatted all over the country, not just in the southern region. So, you know, if we as a movement aren't clear that these are attacks on democracy and that they will fundamentally keep us back, unlike we were in the New Deal, like not recognizing that that compromise would ultimately take us backwards as much as it helped in real time. That is like in some ways the weak spot that has us in the situation we are now. And until we go back to that fundamental clarity around when we were last all pointed in the same direction of trying to build a multiracial democracy, then we will continue to lose. But the hopeful piece of it, and I'm so glad that you pulled hope from it, Margaret, because some people are like, oh, it's so depressing. I'm like, no, it's actually not depressing. We have this live, active base, like people are on our side. We are on their side and they are ready to go. You know, the key thing is what does it take for our movement, instead of to just kind of like show up when there are these hotshot campaigns in the southern region, what would it take to actually build sustained infrastructure in the region to actually support the workers who are, you know, are going to have to stay there. They can't go back to New York, right? Who are going to have to stay there and deal with the backlash, often racist backlash, even if it's not of the employers directly, of people in the political infrastructure in that state. I mean, that's really what happened with the workers in Chattanooga. That's really what we saw in Mississippi. I remember in the Nissan campaign in Canton, there were literally people calling into talk radio threatening that those workers should just go back. They're going to go back to the plantation once the plant closes. And then this is in the 2000s, you know, this is 2017. And so, you know, I think that if we continue to just like silo things as workers' rights over here, and this is our special interest and women's rights and all this kind of stuff, I mean, we're just going to continue to lose. We have to actually see our fight as a fundamental fight for democracy, and as a fight that can't be lost if we are to have a healthy democracy. Like Barbara Field said, the Civil War is still continuing in some ways, at least within the battle of ideas, and it can still be lost. And it's really critical as we talk about this build back better and trying to like come out of this global pandemic and everything, to actually see that as our fight, to see that as our shared fight. This is why I keep saying, you know, we have to spend time to imagine a democracy we're fighting for, that is actually real work. Mm-hmm. And we have to, you know, vision something that people can see themselves in, not just something that's so far off that, like, you know, they can't imagine being a part of that. It has to be as real as the whatever committee at their local church or whatever, you know, library, friends of such and such a library that they might be able to wrap their hands around, to really see that, because we aren't going to be able to win unless people actually know that they want to be a part of democracy, that they want to govern, that it goes beyond their vote once a year, but that their expertise is needed in governing society at whatever level that looks like. Because once people start asking for it, then we have a movement, right? Then we have something to really fight for. And that's been my great frustration with Black workers in the South, because we've known it and have been demanding it, have been asking for it, and have been putting our necks out on the line for it. And it's critical that that actually kicks off a more sustained effort to support that work. The good news, I think, in just kind of looking at the aftermath of the Bessemer vote so far, is that has motivated and inspired so many workers, particularly Black workers in the southern region, let alone workers of all backgrounds at Amazon warehouses around the country, to step up and take action, to say, you know what, if they can do it, like, I have no excuse. And so their union election loss, is really a victory for all of us in some ways, as it kind of set the tone for what's possible and what we need to be asking for.
Yeah, I think that in the South that the community needs to also fight white supremacy, not just the workers in the workplace. And,
Oh, yeah.
and you point out that community does not support in many cases. And I would say that here, at least in some of Oregon communities, there are, I think, signs of racial and multiracial work going on. You know, white people kind of waking up to the lingering effects of white supremacy and the need to really look at equality and democracy, as you point out.
No, that's right. I was actually going to ask both of you about that because I know, Oregon is obviously perhaps furthest away from the U.S. South as you can get almost, but at the same time has its own history of how it was formed, right? And when we look at the, certainly we see white supremacy as a system that impacts all of us, but when we look at the movement of white nationalists that's emerged, there is a lot of that's anchored in Oregon. I was actually curious how the budding multiracial kind of solidarity movement has dealt with that, and what types of really exciting worker fights have kind of come out of it in the state that continue to model what happens when you, I guess, what's the metaphor Heather said, when you reopen the pool.
Refill the pool, yeah.
Refill the pool, yeah. So I don't know if there are any really good campaigns or good, I'm always in for a good campaign story, Lisa. So you gotta give us a.
Well, I'm excited to see the next phase as a lot of the work that multiracial coalitions have been doing in the past several years begin to come to fruition. One both labor and community campaign led by environmental justice organizations and leaders of color was the Portland Clean Energy Fund that began to roll out just in the past month. Funding that will go to frontline communities, specifically around working around climate justice, to begin to advance the needs of our communities of color, specifically with respect to clean energy and workforce development. And that was something that Jobs with Justice and other labor community organizations focused on as a way to drive forward the urgency of climate justice, and in particular the impacts on communities of color. And again, it was communities of color led, but driven also by a multiracial coalition that got out the vote and has been backing implementation of that work. Excited to see what will come out of Oregon and other states, work in mutual aid and solidarity as the pandemic hit and the world shut down while essential workers continue to move forward. It brought new awareness of how essential workers are in fact always essential, whether they're healthcare workers or Instacart delivery drivers. So as we work in Oregon on a just recovery, determining how those experiences over the past year obviously revealed all of the cracks that Smiley, both you and Margaret have referenced historically, but how do we overcome and begin to repair those cracks together with both big D and little d democratic campaigns and fights that bring labor and community together.
I'm so glad you brought up the essential worker frame too, Lisa, because this is a thing that in some ways we've known these workers were always essential, holding up essential aspects of the economy, and the pandemic kind of exposed it. And one of the things that we've had to really fight to keep front and center is their role as essential to the economy, pandemic or no pandemic. And it was interesting because you brought up climate justice as well. That's been another place. We have this campaign we've been supporting in Houston where, they've been organizing essential building service and building trades workers around to be in decision-making position, and really leveraging this framework of essential to help position workers into governing bodies. And the worry was that once everyone was vaccinated, we would lose this framework of essential. No one want to talk about it anymore. But then, they were hit with that winter storm, right? They had this major climate disaster in Texas. And it's been actually really helpful in terms of positioning the role of essential workers, not just in this immediate context that we're living through, but kind of ongoing in terms of how we have to respond to various crises of different forms. And what we noticed during the pandemic is that where working people in essential sectors had decision-making power in some way or another, either through a collective bargaining agreement or labor management committee or something like that, that they were more prepared and we all benefited. There was a great study coming out of George Washington University talking about a comparison of nursing homes and assisted living facilities in Connecticut. And at the assisted living facilities that had union representation, where workers were already perhaps had negotiated preparations and protocols for different crises, there were 30% less COVID deaths in those facilities. I mean, even just anecdotally, going to my local grocery store versus my local Walmart or Target. I mean, just in those early days of chaos that we all remember in March 2020, right? I mean, going into my union grocery store, it was like precision. They kept us at a distance. I mean, those folks were prepared. They had a plan, whereas it was sheer chaos in retail everywhere else, that it was like, oh, so glad they shut half of that down because we were all going to get sick. And so there is something about not just positioning workers as storytellers of the moment, but actually positioning workers as protagonists, everyday people who are able to make decisions and be a part of governing processes at different levels, whether it's on a corporate board, a government agency, in a labor management committee, to be able to weigh in, because those who are closest to a situation are often best prepared to plan for any given crisis or surprise that we might not be ready for.
Right. They have a voice and there's a structure.
That's right.
I want to give a shout out in Oregon to the Latinx community. We have a CAUSA here, which does a political work, and PECUN, which does the economic and community organizing work. And they, just as an example of the multiracial campaign, created the Oregon Worker Defense Fund for people that weren't eligible for the relief, the pandemic relief stimulus checks. So I think that, the Latino workforce is growing, important, essential, underpaid, and
that's right. And not just like the undocumented workers overall, both of Latinx descent as well as of Asian descent and Black immigrant workers. In DC earlier this year, DC Jobs for Justice was able to win $8 million from the city to cover, what would have been stimulus for undocumented essential workers. And just more recently in New York State, they won $212 billion back for essential workers who are undocumented. I mean, there's a reason why, there's a bill in Congress now saying that we should win a pathway to citizenship for all essential workers, because so many of them are undocumented workers. And like, how can we treat, it's been so much better for us to have this framework of essential to really clarify the position of power that these workers have in the economy, when in the past we've just been like, oh, low-wage workers, undocumented workers, immigrant workers. I mean, they are those things, but those things describe the oppression. They don't describe the power. Essential describes the powerful role that they play in the economy. And it's just been profound, the transformation, both in terms of how we talk about it and try to organize around this question of democracy and worker governance, but also, I think, culturally, in terms of how everyday people are seen by their communities, that it's not just the heroes of the EMT and the doctors and the firefighters, but also the retail employees, the food service workers and the like.
Well said.
Absolutely.
Well said.
And great shout out to PECUN and CAUSA. That's fantastic. Yes.
Well, and speaking of PECUN and CAUSA, as if, enduring the effects of the pandemic were not enough, certainly here on the West Coast, when we experience the devastation of wildfires on communities and the fractures that reveal, and how folks are able to stay healthy and housed. An example of a rising labor and community campaign in Oregon is to establish a standard for worker health and safety relative to heat and smoke. So whether
Mm.
workers are indoors or outdoors, whether they are, farm workers or nursery workers that, Pikun often works with, other essential workers that deal with the impacts of smoke in the sky, regardless of how close they may be to a wildfire as the climate changes. Workers that may labor outside of the public eye on a regular basis, coming together to build a movement to change the conditions that will make their communities and the work that they do safer and make them more resilient in having the resources to be able to deal with living and working in the climate.
Well, you bring it back to another point, and I know we probably want to get to Q&A here in a second, but just to like put a fine point on some of the stuff that you're saying, and through the lens of collective bargaining, right, which is what we kind of come at with Jobs with Justice, is we want to expand the ability of many people to organize and collectively bargain, and we want to expand the ways in which they can do it. And one of those, which I feel like has come up a lot from the West Coast, from Oregon and California, is this notion of bargaining for the common good, which is like really seeing the bargaining table as a site of struggle for issues impacting workers as whole people, not just the workplace itself. And some of the things that we've been able to negotiate in workplace policy around climate have been really profound, especially in terms of those who are experiencing wildfires, let alone flooding, which is what we have here in New Jersey, where I live, right? So that's like one thing that's been pretty powerful, is to really think through expanding the demands that are made at the negotiation table. But the other thing that we've seen in some places is what I like to call like community-driven strategies, where people apply the framework of collective bargaining to something that's not immediately a workplace issue. Like consider medical debtors at a particular hospital. Everyone who carries debt from this hospital comes together and tries to actually renegotiate that debt with a hospital or the bank, or likewise with other economic relationships. And then, the last one, and this is all in like the book that'll be coming out, but just to like put a fine point on it, it's like this idea of bargaining with the ultimate benefactor. So looking at whether it's a climate disaster and a particular company that might be making it worse, or even looking at an individual. Like my favorite example is like Rob Walton and Greg Penner, like the owners of Walmart, right? Like who own like the six of them own more wealth than over half of the country. And I think it's actually gone higher now for obvious reasons. But, he sits on the board, obviously, of Walmart, but also of Hallett, of the Charter School Growth Fund, of Arvis Bank, I think it is, right? Like imagining all the workers who are at Walmart, Hyatt, all the other companies coming together and forming joint bargaining units to negotiate, or even like the teachers who are at the charter schools funded by his growth fund, like coming together in joint bargaining units to negotiate with the Walton family, and not just going to their company, not in lieu of, but to actually really expand the nature of how negotiations happen. And I think the same is true with some of the experiments. We were talking about this earlier, Lisa, some of the experiments in bargaining at the sectoral level. I don't know that it's in lieu of going from enterprise to enterprise, but actually thinking through how we raise the floor. This is like Fight for 15 is a sectoral strategy. It is raise the floor. Right. Now we want to negotiate on top of that, right? And so like that's how we should be thinking about all of these strategies. It's really a let every flower bloom, because in a healthy democracy, workers would be able to govern at all of those levels.
Well, and both of you have referenced the caring economy and the work that like Fight for 15 has done, as well as home care workers in Oregon who were first, among the country to sweep and be able to form a union. Sort of the next step that will necessitate collective bargaining strategies that are different from workplace by workplace is supporting additional home care workers who are employed in the private sector and work for, dozens, if not hundreds of different private sector employers. What is the strategy to ensure that, in-home caregivers who don't work for the public sector to be able to build power to negotiate collectively over conditions that affect those who are caring for our seniors in long-term care facilities, in assisted living facilities, and importantly in their own homes.
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to the social insurance thing that Margaret was talking about earlier. I know there was a really, we tried to win universal family care in Maine for this exact reason, this question of like the private sector home care workers. Could we create some kind of tripartite body where everyone, both the providers and the suppliers and the government would be able to elect people to a board to set of standards, and we didn't win for a lot of reasons. I mean, we like to say you learn more from your mistakes than you do from your successes, but that's still a strategy we want to try to open up and at a broader scale.
That's really worth fighting for, to get that infrastructure concept in there so that we can create some structure for the workers and the people that are being cared for.
That's right.
Yes. Hi, everybody. This is Ellen again. I thought I would pop in because you read my mind, Margaret. We have a number of questions from audience members, including one about the term infrastructure. And I know you used it, and the subject of infrastructure has come up in your conversation so far, especially in relation to the care economy. And the question posed by Bob Bussell, who directs our Labor Education and Research Center, is that we have a golden opportunity at this moment, since everybody is talking about infrastructure, to reframe that term and that idea in ways that emphasize its social features and advance principles of democracy, justice, and equity. We would love to hear each of you talk about practical strategies for advancing the idea that human beings, whether they participate in the care economy or other forms of essential work, can really be incorporated in a meaningful way into our ideas about infrastructure and big investment in the future of infrastructure.
Well, I think that the conversation that's going on right now, sorry. I think the conversation that's going on right now about the care infrastructure is a really healthy one. And it's being framed correctly, which is that you need roads to get to work. You need a care economy to be able to get to work. It's what creates the ability to have a functioning economy. And they have an such an underfunded wide sector that really relies on the exploitation of labor.
Right.
That's the key ingredient you have low-wage women paying other low-wage women to take care of their children, and as a public good, we need to erase that and create a system so that everybody can participate in the economy in an equal way, and that's not possible right now. And so I think that looking at the social and equality aspects of that is really, really important. I couldn't be more pleased with the proposals that are coming out on that.
Yeah, and just to add to what Margaret's saying, I have to say, so Jobs for Justice founded Caring Across Generations campaign a while ago, and I always kind of got this on like a theoretical level, could talk about it for days in this context, but there was a moment where I got it at this like incredibly deep guttural level that I had never gotten before. And it was this unexpected moment. I was in Berlin actually talking about the Caring Across Generations campaign. And I had to walk past these different apartment buildings, and every apartment building had a childcare facility and a cafeteria by nature of living there. Like your rent or whatever paid for that. It was just there. It was built in. Yeah. And I had never seen it with my own eyes in motion. It wasn't someone's grandmother. It wasn't just informal care. These were well-paid workers who were paid by the building to look after your children and also feed you at times. And it's just, you can't underestimate the significance of how that then helps a percentage of people that helps to work, particularly women who've been burdened with the majority of domestic care, right? So like, there's something in there that in that culture, it was so normal. It was very odd not to have childcare. Why would you have to look for childcare? It's where you live. Likewise, like as we think about care in public schools, and like how not having access to like sending kids to school has impacted forced so many to leave the workforce. Like, I think thinking about that as this fundamental infrastructure that keeps us working, that allows us to sustain ourselves, is critical. And it's just one example of how I was able to see it with my own eyes in a way that I had not seen before.
I mean,
Well, Rosalind Carter once said, you're either someone who's caring for others or going to care for others, or you're somebody that's receiving care or will be receiving care in the future.
That's right. Or all of the above.
Right.
And I couldn't be proud, in speaking about caregiver infrastructure, particularly for childcare workers, I couldn't be prouder of labor and community efforts here in Portland. In the last election, passed a measure that will establish a universal preschool that will not only enable an increasing number of 3- and 4-year-olds to get early childhood education, but will also provide supports for childcare workers to form unions under conditions where, whomever the employer is will remain neutral and support what childcare workers' choice in forming a union is. That again lifts up the importance of the caring economy and the childcare workers, as well as the children in their care, and helps to make that infrastructure more visible in the community. And I think that additional good things will come that could, as you reference, Smiley, like you might encounter in Europe, a child care center in every neighborhood and community, so that folks are able to live and work and build communities stronger in that way. I know there must be questions, but one thing I would love to ask you, Margaret, as we talk about both very expansive ideas, experimental ideas, approaches, that unions and communities from across the country bring, is decades ago when you drove the work around pay equity, you must have created such reactions that I hope now are really part of the fabric of how we address women's economic needs, the needs of women workers specifically. So I have hope that some of the ideas that seem a little bit out there will become part of our culture. And just wondering if you have perspective given where pay equity remains now and the work that you were able to lead in that regard.
Well, it was invigorating and disappointing in the end, of course. But I will say that there were two outcomes of the pay equity fight that I think are really important. One is it built our union. All of a sudden, women began to speak out, and I can remember them testifying in front of the legislature, holding up their pay stubs, and the legislators gasping at the low wages that they were receiving for really essential work. And then, and so this whole new era of women leaders in the labor movement had just blossomed, and it continues. And the other is that they did understand about women's work and how it was undervalued. And the reason that it was the women-dominated jobs were so low wage is that men didn't recognize it as work.
Right.
And so the work that we did on evaluating jobs and all of that, I mean, I didn't like whole parts of it, but it was an aha moment about what is essential work, what is difficult work, and what is valuable. And so we have a long ways to go still. We haven't completely narrowed that gap, but thank you, Lisa. I do think that there are these notions that carry on over time. Mm-hmm. And that I think now the racial reckoning that we're under is going to fundamentally change people's understanding and the lack of democracy that we have, and the need to continue to fight the Civil War, as Smiley says.
I feel like if nothing else clarified that care is a fundamental part of infrastructure, this pandemic has clarified. I mean, the number of people who've had to, even whether they were working from home or not, like being able to maneuver and negotiate childcare with schools closed. I mean, we've got to really make this thing such that 10 years from now, like you say, Lisa, it's woven into our fabric. It's a no-brainer. People in Berlin are like, what do you mean? Of course we have childcare.
So let me ask one more question directed from a member of our audience. And I know you were talking a few minutes ago about Latinx workplace and community organizing here in Oregon, but a member of the audience is interested in perhaps more national examples and perspectives on Latinx workers and communities. What union organizing efforts in workplaces with large Latinx populations are occurring or are planned for the future? And since you're talking about the indispensability of community-supported labor campaigns, perhaps you can talk about that, especially in light of the enormous diversity within the Latinx population.
I was going to say that's a really big question. I mean, we could focus on a couple of different sectors here, but one perhaps most news that got most coverage in the news over the last year was in meatpacking, and particularly in poultry. And it's interesting because right before the pandemic, there had been a raid in Morton, Mississippi, that displaced hundreds of Latinx workers, many undocumented, from Mexico, from Guatemala, from Honduras, from different places. And it was very difficult. We ended up actually sending people to try to do intake, just to even understand, like, on the, not just on the immigration side, but on as workers, right? Because they raided some of the smaller, I shouldn't say smaller, but smaller than, say, Tyson's poultry plants, still really fairly big, but didn't raid the big ones, Tyson's or Purdue, which in itself was like shady, for lack of a better word. But then, of course, during the pandemic, what we saw were that a lot of these poultry plants that employed immigrant workers, particularly from Latinx communities, were, the Trump administration used the Defense of Production Act to keep them working, not to actually transition to help people work to make, I don't know, ventilators or things we actually needed, right? But to keep them working in unsafe conditions. And that was kind of the latest, I guess, agitator or catalyst to spark more worker organizing. The interesting thing about meatpacking, and I'm not a complete expert like our friends at the United Food and Commercial Workers, but I do remember the Smithfield campaign in North Carolina, in Tar Heel, North Carolina. And at that plant, they had a significant number of Latino and Latinx workers, Indigenous Native American workers, Black workers, and white workers. And they were fairly segregated. The white workers were generally the mechanics. The Black workers generally worked the slaughter floor. Latinx workers tended to be like in the, I don't know how, for those of you guys might be vegetarian, I don't know, like the gizzard shop. Anyway, without going into further detail. And that campaign took like 14 years, 16 years to win, with multiple union elections lost. But at the end of it, the only way that they ended up winning was by building a multiracial coalition. Because in the first round, it was easy for the company to just swipe off, like literally cut off the immigrant workforce. Like, threatened ICE raids, people were gone. The Latinx community and Latinx workers in the plants were at Fish originally the most militant. And so, they came and had like a big action, and the local priest, Catholic Church, came and supported them, and just bam, all fired, raided, just like cut off, right? The company did. And so that was both like a crisis and a devastating defeat, but also a wake-up call for the workers who then remained in the plant about the necessity of multiracial organizing. And I think we're certainly seeing that throughout the Latinx community. Again, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on this, but I think that what we're realizing is that the framework of essential for workers in essential sectors like meatpacking, like building services, like food services, has helped us create not only a political clarity around how these workers are important to our economy and must be treated fairly and well, but also a cultural understanding that these are important workers. They are not to be trashed on. There's like I don't want to say like, total reputation kind of thing, but, like we would look at a firefighter or think our essential workers, we see them now. There's a visibilization that happens. Second, I think that the influx of Latinx workers from, I guess, our American colony of like Puerto Rico right after their storm, right, which is really increased the population of Florida in a very different way. It's created a different form of opportunity around organizing the Latinx community. So anyway, I don't want to go too far down a rabbit hole, but I want to just say, like, the Latinx community in itself is not a monolith, and there are many different trends, and how that looks in different sectors shows up very differently. But I think this has been an opportunity to not just go the way that immigrant rights movements have in the past, and just trying to like Americanize and show like we all belong here, but actually to show that undocumented workers are a part of the business model of this country, and that, we're either going to treat them as such or, at our own peril not do so, and so that's something that has been, I think, made abundantly clear in the course of the pandemic.
Okay, here's another big question that takes us in a different direction based on a comment from a member of our audience. Do you think that this is a moment for labor and community organizers to speak up about defense spending? I read, with the very, very first draft of the federal budget, I think it was released at the end of last week, there were enormous increases in many places, not so much with defense, but certainly no decrease in the defense budget. What is your take on the wisdom of that at this moment?
Well, I'm not active right now in a campaign, but I can say that I wish that we didn't have the defense budget that we have. It's really outrageous. I don't know about the wisdom of taking it on in a campaign. I'll let that go over to Smiley and Lisa.
Yeah, I don't know. I know that it is kind of one of those ongoing topics that we have to navigate, especially when it comes to thinking about what we're trying to budget money for, and that we often end up with these kind of small pots compared to defense budgets. And it's a similar dynamic around the movement for Black Lives demand on defunding the police, right? And there's there's righteousness in both demands. At the same time, there's nuance. There are workers who are paid for by local police budgets that are not police, who are often low-income Black women. There are workers paid for by the defense budget that aren't military, and like, what does that mean? And so I think there's got to be, I think, part of what we want to be thinking about when we talk about a transition into a multiracial democracy are the same types of ways we want to approach the sequencing of like a just transition to a healthy climate, right? Is really thinking through the nuances of who are we trying to impact, what are we actually trying to change, and what are the steps to doing that. I remember one of my earliest 25 years ago agitations around the death penalty, and how we were making no ground when it came to abolishing the death penalty, but we started talking about moratorium and we started winning all over the place. I think thinking about how we want to reorganize what defense means and looks like, and how we want to reorganize what policing is, who shows up for what kind of call, whether or not they can be armed or not, like these types of questions, I think will give us some insight into what that might look like. And certainly I'm speaking very theoretically. I think in a lot of these campaigns, we can't really start to put something in play until we have like a place that's willing to test it, that's willing to say, okay, we're going to make it such that social work and mental health professionals show up first before an armed police officer or something. And I think likewise with defense, I think it actually is a bigger conversation about what our role in the world is, what are the different actors, and how do we feel like, what's a democratic and what's a solidarity internationalist approach to that. And that's a very big question. I don't want to claim that have all the answers on it, but it's a much bigger question than just cutting the existing defense budget. And I'm someone who really believes in understanding the world as it is and not as we would always like it to be, and what that could mean, just being really realistic about it.
Yeah, I think well stated, Smiley, and I would just, friendly additional amendment to say is like, when is it never the time, to talk about, community safety and priorities and what that really means. So you can take on the entirety as leaders and activists have for years, the defense budget, or begin to chip away at chunks of it to reprioritize. What happens to our veterans when they return to our communities, needing mental health, housing, job supports?
Right.
How do we organize around that in the same way that, many communities, including, here in Portland and Eugene, communities in Oregon have, are retooling what community safety means. So as you said, Smiley, it's, mental health professionals who can show up and help, individuals in crisis identify what they need, and could probably likely identify that 9.5 times out of 10, it's not an armed
police officer
that they, need in crisis at that moment. So
yeah, we're pretty proud of our cahoots here, which is become a national model.
Right.
Yeah.
And,
well,
now,
crisis teams helping out on the streets. Yeah.
Right.
Okay, well, we have just 5 minutes left, but I would like to give each of you one final brief opportunity to share with members of our audience something that gives you hope as you are looking forward to thinking about the kind of democracy you've talked about today, the kind that's worth fighting for, that we all need to build. Just something quick from each of you.
I think that the pandemic has all these intersecting crises, which has raised awareness of several things that we've talked about: the racial oppression and inequalities, the lack of voice at the workplace, and things like the care economy. And I think that has elevated our understanding and our movement to really address those issues, and that gives me hope.
Here, here.
Lisa?
You want to go next, Lisa? Yeah.
I have to borrow again from you, Comrade Smiley, in talking about not leaving power on the table. And for me, there is always hope in continuing to draw from the strength of labor and community together. So encouraging that I see many unions working to, look internally and externally and center racial justice, knowing that it is inseparable from economic justice. And it gives me hope that work and that leadership continues to strengthen the work between unions and communities together to tackle what we need. Don't leave that power on the table.
Don't leave it on the table. I love it. I love it. Well, without ramming it into the ground, that I think the resilience of working people gives me on a daily basis gives me hope. Seeing people survive this pandemic and go through the racial reckoning over the summer and come out of it still trying to fight. And so, like, watching the workers in Amazon who were inspired by the uprisings after George Floyd's murder and said they aren't going to take it anymore. They're essential. They deserve respect. That gives me a ton of hope. And just I tell you, our folks are so resilient. We can take on the world. And look, if my ancestors managed to survive and win the abolition of slavery, then we can take on a little pandemic. We can beat this thing.
Hear, hear.
Well, knowing that the three of you are doing the work that you are in the labor and community movements that are necessary to building our future is what gives me hope. So I would like to thank all three of you, especially Erica Smiley, but also Margaret Hallock, to whom we are indebted for so much, and Lisa Hubbard with Portland Jobs with Justice. It's been a pleasure hosting you, and I know you have certainly reminded me, and I trust everyone who has been listening to your conversation, not only that democracy is worth fighting for, but that an inclusive, vibrant, and expansive democracy is something that is a work in progress for every new generation, every new individual. It is a work of participation and activism, not a spectator sport, as we say.
That's right.
And that, I think, is an enormously important and timely message for us all. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone who attended this event, and we look forward to seeing you at a future Wayne Moore Center event. Be healthy and take good care of yourselves and one another. Bye.
Thank you all.